you just have to email me, and I'll see if I can find some time. Today's pretty tight, but I might be able to find like 20 minutes, some time there. Okay. 2. All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get started. So, Tuesday, we got thinking about blood vessels. So we've been looking at the heart as an effector, as a tool to change mean arterial pressure. Now we're going to be looking at blood vessels as a tool to change mean arterial pressure, okay? So we're going to wander around that schematic, thinking about the aorta, resistance arterioles, capillaries, and veins. Then once we put all that in place, we will have all the tools we need to then start seeing how the body would respond to a change in mean arterial pressure. Okay, so we got to talking about blood vessels, and that all of these blood vessels that we're going to talk about have some combination of these layers. Okay, that capillaries only had that endothelial cell layer. They're optimized for exchange. Arteries and veins will have a certain combination of these layers in order to do what they need to do for transport and for storage. Arterioles will have a combination of these layers all jacked up in the smooth muscle cell area, because that's where we're going to be changing resistance. Okay, so again, there's the nature of this wall will dictate how that compartment behaves. Okay, so the nature of this wall then dictates that functional compartmentalization that we talked about. Okay, so the core of that functional compartmentalization of the cardiovascular system lies in what did the layers of the wall look like. Now, the interesting thing about this wall is that you can't go ahead and predict what it's going to look like based on what its function is. So, for instance, to make a more rigid tube, you would think you would have a lot more connective tissue, but the aorta does not have a lot more connective tissue. Or to make a really elastic compartment like the veins, you'd think, oh, well, I have this huge elastin layer in the veins. That's not true. The very interesting thing is when you look at a vessel cross-section, you can't predict what its behavior is going to be. You just have to test its behavior, okay? So for example, when we look at pressure-volume relationships in arteries and in veins, when you do a cross-section of an artery and a vein and you look at it, you would never be able to predict this behavior. All you can do is go in and do the experiment, do the test, to see what its behavior is. Okay, so that's why we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at the cross-sections of these walls, because it doesn't really matter. We're not going to gain any more insight into how this thing is going to behave by looking at that cross-section. So you just need to know, yep, there's a general cross-section with those layers that we looked at, and then this is how they behave. Okay, so we're going to jump real quick, not to thinking about the anatomy or the structure here, but jump right into function. So, for example, if we look at a volume-pressure relationship, so if I change volume in a vessel, let's say I have a piece of the vessel, and I'm changing volume in it, and I'm measuring the pressure in it. Okay, so if I have, let's say, a large artery. Okay, large artery, the aorta, and have a small amount of volume in it. Okay, we're talking about 100 mils, let's say. And then I add a small amount of volume, let's say 20 more mils to it. The pressure goes way up. And they add a little bit more volume, and the pressure goes way up, right? So what this is telling us is when I add a little bit of volume, I get this massive change in pressure. It's a very rigid compartment. Okay, it's not like a balloon. If I were to fill up a balloon and the balloon would expand out as I add volume, the pressure doesn't go up as much. It doesn't go up very high, right? Very elastic compartment. Okay, this large artery, very small changes in volume resulting in large changes in pressure indicate we have a rigid compartment here. Okay, great, Because large arteries were for transport. We want to get blood from point A to point B. So why not just make a rigid tube and fire that blood through it, okay? So here, let's just interpret the graph in words so everyone's on the same page. Small changes in volume. Equal large changes in pressure. And these are physiologically relevant volumes as well. This is not just an experiment that we've pulled the volumes out of nowhere. Okay, indeed, you do not have a large volumes in the aorta or in the large arteries. Okay, so this tells us this is a really stiff, rigid compartment. Really non-compliant, okay? And that's in opposition to what veins look like. Okay, veins, and again, these are physiologically relevant volumes. Veins can have, let's say, 2.5 liters of volume in them and have very low pressures. 1 or 2 or 3 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and I can actually go ahead and add 500 mils, right? 500 mils. That's like 1.5 beer, right? That's a standard unit. 1.5 beer. That's almost more than half a bottle of wine, right? I add that, only like 1 or 2 millimeters of mercury pressure difference. Okay, so this thing is expanding now as we start to add very elastic compartment. Okay, I can even go ahead and add like 4.5 liters. We're talking liters in that compartment, and I'm still not going to get over 7 or 8 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so this is telling us a lot about the nature of that vessel wall. Very compliant, very elastic. Okay, now if you think about it, it has to be that way. We need a very low pressure system on the venous side, right? Or else we're not going to get flow. Pressure has to drop through the entire cardiovascular system, right? We cannot have a high pressure system on the venous side or you will stop all flow, okay? So veins, very compliant compartment. Okay, very elastic. And in terms of interpreting the graph in words, we have large changes in volume result in small changes in pressure. Ideal for storage. Okay, if you want to at rest, a human at rest doesn't actually need 5.5 liters of volume, right? But when suddenly you get up and exercise and you need to increase perfusion of tissue, right? We really need to work that volume, okay? So veins are considered a storage area. But we got to build it that way. It's got to be low pressure or else we're not going to get flow across the entire cardiovascular system. Okay, so at the end of the day then too, the nature of the wall is going to determine the characteristics or the behavior of these vessels. Okay, so how did we get there? It was the nature of the wall, and I can't really tell you what about those characteristics made it that way, but it is what it is, okay? So the nature of the wall of the vessel determines the behavior of the vessel. All right, so then let's start stepping through each one of those compartments. Okay, so let's start with that. Let's start with the compartment after the left ventricle. So we're going to stick to the systemic side. Okay, so let's start with thinking about the aortic compartment. Okay, so we're just going to go through 4 different compartments here. So the aortic or the arterial compartment is what we're looking at. Now we've seen this relationship before. We've seen this pressure relationship over time with the left ventricle. Okay, so this is left ventricular pressure that's on here, so this shape should look familiar. Okay. We also have a depiction of aortic pressure. That shape should look familiar as well because we overlaid that on top of our pressure volume loops when we talked about the heart. Okay, so we're just going to recap here that we had when the ventricle was in diastole, so the heart is not ejecting blood. Actually, let's change these numbers to ones that we've been talking about. Let's change this axis to 80 and 120. So when the ventricle is in diastole, it's not ejecting volume, so that aortic pressure, where that aortic volume is decreasing, right? Because it is moving blood is moving from that compartment into the rest of the systemic system, so into the arterioles and the capillaries. So we are losing volume out of this compartment, so we are losing pressure out of that aortic compartment. Okay, till we get to the pressure right at the end of diastole, right? So we talked about that as diastolic pressure. Okay, and that's going to be 80. We've been talking about that as 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so right at the end of the ventricular stage of diastole, we have a pressure of about 80. So then we get systole, so we get ventricular contraction. All right, so we begin to, the muscle has got the action potential and is beginning to contract, closes the mitral valve, right? So we've got the mitral valve closing here. The mitral valve closes, the aortic valve isn't open, so blood has nowhere to go. So as we start to contract against a fixed volume, pressure will shoot way up. Okay, so now we're starting to generate lots of pressure in that ventricle, right? And when we start, and we will continue to generate pressure and not eject volume until we can get another valve open, right? So we get that aortic valve open by overcoming the pressure that was currently in the aorta. So the pressure that was in the aorta at the end of diastole was around 80 millimeters of mercury. So the ventricle has to generate more than 80 millimeters of mercury to open that aortic valve. Okay, so as soon as we open that aortic valve, the ventricle starts to eject volume, right? Where is it ejecting volume into? Into the aorta. So volume and pressure in the aorta go up, okay, because that's where the volume is headed. Right, so right here, we get our aortic valve opening. So our aortic valve opens. We start to eject, the heart starts to eject volume now. Volume is going into the aorta. So we get an increase in volume and an increase in pressure in the aorta. And as long as ventricular volume stays above aortic volume, that aortic valve will stay open. Right, so as long as this gray line here, it's kind of hard to see, this gray line here, the pressure in the ventricle stays above the pressure in the aorta, that aortic valve will stay open and we will continue to eject volume. Okay, and then the aortic, or the ventricle stops contracting. Okay, so that's going to happen in around here somewhere. So we go back into diastole. Okay, so now the heart is starting to relax, right? So pressure will drop. And when pressure in the ventricle drops below pressure in the aortic valve closes. Okay? So here we get where the aortic valve is closing. Aortic, oh my gosh. You get this little funky pressure wave, something that they call the dichroic notch. This is thought to be, so when I've got a valve open, right, so I'm ejecting volume from my left ventricle up into my aorta. I've got that valve open. And then in order to actually, when pressure in the left ventricle drops below pressure in that aorta, a little bit of volume will flow backwards to close. That's actually what's closing that valve. Okay, so we're going to lose a little bit of volume, so we lose a little bit of pressure in that aorta. We snap that shut, and then we start to get a true reading of what the volume and what the pressure is in that aorta the moment it's shut. So the moment it's shut, so right at the top of that notch, is what they think is the true measure of the pressure and the volume there. Okay, because before that, things were still moving. Volume was moving a little bit, so we weren't really getting an accurate measure of what the volume in that aorta was and what the pressure in that aorta was. But as soon as that aortic valve closes, we get an instantaneous, true measure of what pressure, or what the volume in that aorta is and what the pressure in that aorta is. Okay, and then pressure drops in the aorta. So the heart's still in diastole. The pressure drops in the aorta because volume is leaving that compartment. So there's a little bit of elasticity here, and when you pumped blood into it, you did expand it a little bit, and now it's going back to its normal shape and ejecting volume in the only direction it can, which is forward into the arteries, small arterioles, et cetera, because the aortic valve is closed. Okay, so we're going to start to lose volume from that aortic compartment, so we're going to start to lose pressure from that aortic compartment. Okay, so this is volume leaving the compartment. Okay, so volume leaves that compartment, and it leaves so volume is dropping, so pressure is dropping until we get ourselves back down to about a pressure of 80. By that time, the heart is ready to go into systole again, and we do the whole thing over again, okay? So we go from here back to here, fill the compartment up. The highest pressure and the highest volume that the aorta is going to experience is called systolic pressure. Systolic pressure, the pressure in the aorta when the heart is in systole. Okay, we take that highest pressure. So that's your classic, your blood pressure being measured as 120/80, right? What's the highest pressure that's ever seen in that aorta, and what's the lowest pressure ever seen in that aorta, right? And you've got a healthy range, and then you have ranges that are unhealthy. Okay, so that's kind of what the classic 120/80 is giving us. We think a lot about mean arterial pressure because it gets a little confusing in regulating all this by thinking about 120/80, so we just pop in an average. The average, to calculate mean arterial pressure, because you spend more time in diastole than you do systole, it should be a weighted average, right? So the weighted average, if we calculated mean arterial pressure, based on that weighted average, that we spend more time at lower pressures than we do higher, we're going to calculate a mean arterial pressure of around 96. Okay, so that's great. We can be exact, or we'll just round it up to 100 and move on. Okay, so that's why we talk about mean arterial pressure being 100. Indeed, that's not the exact calculation, but it's good enough for what we're going to be trying to do here. Yeah. So can I help you differentiate between the aortic or the dichroic notch and the aortic valve closing? Yeah, so the aortic valve was closing, so it's not at a specific, I haven't depicted it necessarily as a specific point, but the aortic valve absolutely closes, it's closed like right in there, okay? Because, right, because that's where aortic pressure, aortic pressure becomes slightly greater than ventricular pressure. So the moment that happens, bam, that thing shuts. Okay, and then we get this weird wiggle because we've stopped flow happening, trapped volume in that aorta, and now we get this expression of what is that volume and what is that pressure. Okay, so yeah, oh, I see, in terms of what the shape is. Yeah, I think that they would argue that this whole thing is called the notch. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so pressure, we're going to talk about pressure as being approximately 100 millimeters of mercury. Okay. And why do we care about this aortic compartment in particular? That's where that's where the body takes a measure of mean arterial pressure. So when we set up sensors in this system in a couple of days, that's where we're going to put them. Okay, so that's where the body, this is the compartment that the body is measuring. What is pressure, and do I need to change what the body's doing? Okay. So essentially so then the game afoot then for the body and for us is to keep track of what is the average pressure in this compartment. Because if that average pressure goes up, then we know how the body's going to respond to bring it back down. If that average pressure goes down, then we can predict how the body's going to respond to bring that back up. Okay, so the entire game afoot for the cardiovascular system is what is pressure in this compartment. Okay, so then we need to look at the determinants of pressure, average pressure in this compartment. So we will model it as a compartment to try to keep track of these variables. Okay, so very simply, if we model it as a compartment, so if this is our aortic compartment, we can have a volume going into that aortic compartment, and we have volume moving out of that aortic compartment. And if volume in equals volume out, then that pressure is going to be constant, right? I don't care about volume through it. This is critical to this argument. Okay? And we're going to use this argument for a very long time. I don't care about what goes through it. I care about what's going into it and what's going out of it and how are they matched. And if in is higher than out, pressure goes up. All right, if out is greater than in, pressure goes down. Okay, so that's the game we're going to play. So what is responsible for volume going into the aorta? Well, it's the heart, right? We've just showed how we filled it up with heart function. So essentially it's the heart that's responsible for volume going in. Essentially the heart, it was cardiac output, right? We've just been messing with all of the things that affect cardiac output. Okay, cardiac output is really that volume. That was wrong. There we are. Cardiac output represents volume going into that aorta, filling that compartment. All right? And you know an awful lot about that. You know about how heart rate is going to affect this now. You know how, and systolic volume is going to affect this. Okay? You know an awful lot about filling this container already. So take all that information that you know about cardiac output, and that relates to filling that compartment. Okay? So what empties this compartment? What's responsible for the outflow of this compartment? That's Downstream are these resistance arterioles that we talked about, okay? They are responsible for moving volume out of the aorta. So their contractile state now is going to dictate the volume coming out of the aorta. What's coming into and what's going out of dictates what is in. Okay, so those are there. That's how we're going to argue it. Into and out of. Once we look at their balance, we now know what's in it. If we have a higher volume in it, we have a higher pressure in it. Increased mean arterial pressure. Okay? So let's just write down an example of that so we've got it down. So for instance, if I were to increase cardiac output, so let's say I did some maneuver with the heart to increase cardiac output, right? So that represents an increase in volume into the aorta. And I didn't change the resistance arterioles. Let's say they stayed constant. So volume out of the compartment remained constant. So volume out of the aorta is a constant. So that really means the arterioles didn't change. Then volume in the aorta has to have gone up. Volume into went up. Volume out of stayed constant. So volume in had to be higher. Okay? If volume in is higher, pressure in is higher. Pressure in the aorta is higher, that's an increase in mean arterial pressure. Okay? Let's write that down. Arterioles did not change. Okay. Therefore, we're going to increase volume in the aorta. Okay? Which is going to result in an increase in pressure in the aorta. And why do we care about that? Because the body absolutely cares about regulating it. The moment you see an increase in mean arterial pressure, the body is going to change itself to bring that back down. Okay? So, how might we change cardiac output? Right, so the premise was I changed cardiac output. So how do we change cardiac output? Okay, well, this is back to our end, the determinants that dictated what cardiac output was. It can't be anything else, so we're not going to bring anything new and fancy in here. All we have are the determinants of cardiac output. They were end diastolic volume, end systolic volume, and heart rate. Stroke volume and heart rate. That was all it was. But you know an awful lot about how those things are controlled now, don't you? You know how the sympathetic nervous system can mess with that. Right? Contractility of the heart, heart rate. You know how heart rate changes contractility. Okay? So you know an awful lot about what we're talking about right now. Okay, that's where that information fits. So for example, if I were to bring some of that thinking forward, if I were to increase my sympathetic nervous system output, so let's say something is happening, the body's responding, I increase, actually what do we do here? I increase mean arterial pressure. Okay, now let's increase cardiac output because that's what we're dealing with. How do I increase cardiac output? I can increase my sympathetic nervous system output to a ventricular myocyte. Okay, and that's going to increase contractility. So increase force of contraction. That's going to drop my end systolic volume, increase my stroke volume, increase my cardiac output, which is going to increase my mean arterial pressure. Okay, and then we would be able to handle that, but we can't handle it for a couple of days because we have to build sensors that sense that problem and then change the system. Okay? But at the end of the day, this is the compartment that we're going to be coming back to all the time. What is the volume in there, and what is the pressure in there? Because that's what the body cares about. Okay? Any thoughts on the aorta? Gotta have a question for me somewhere? We're good? Okay. We will return to that over and over and over again. That's not the last time you've seen that argument. Okay, let's head on to the next compartment. Those arterioles, so these are downstream of the aorta and the arteries. Okay, these resistance arterioles. So in terms of flow across the whole system, these are generating resistance for us. So if we're thinking about flow across the whole system, flow is dictated by a pressure drop, right? So remember we talked about the heart generating that high pressure across the system. That's what we needed a pump for. And then flow is inversely proportional to the resistance that's offered, and this is what these blood vessels are going to offer, resistance through the system. Okay? So then what's dictating resistance, or what are the components of resistance that we need to think about? So resistance is indeed, what are the determinants of resistance? Are a constant 8, the viscosity and the length of vessels dictate resistance, pi, because that's fun, and then radius dictates resistance, okay? So if we look at all the determinants of resistance, we've got a constant in the numerator, so we're going to abandon that. The length and the number of vessels is dictated by, or is indicated by L there. The viscosity is that weird term. And the vessel radius. Okay, so that's how they're related. So when we think about, okay, so the body could change all of those things to mess with resistance, absolutely. Right? But the body can't change some of them on a time scale that's going to help you change your mean arterial pressure. Okay, so we can get rid of some of these issues. So like the length and the number of vessels is going to take growth of a whole new vessel. That is going to take days to weeks. So you're not going to solve a mean arterial pressure problem by waiting to grow a new vessel. Okay, that might be a long-term thing that you do. So people who exercise and train, they will grow new vessels, right? But that's going to take weeks. Okay, that's a little bit longer than how we are going to be regulating mean arterial pressure on the time scales we care about, which are milliseconds to seconds, seconds to minutes, and then hours. We might even scooch that into days. But when it takes weeks, it's not going to be something that we're going to be using as a regulative tool to regulate mean arterial pressure. Okay, so we're not going to deal with length and number of vessels as a way to regulate mean arterial pressure or resistance. Okay? Viscosity is something that you can change over hours, so we can look at viscosity as a tool that the body might use. Okay, it's not common. It's usually a provoked response to something else. But we can change it in hours, so let's throw it out there. So viscosity is the viscosity of the blood. That's what we're talking about here, the viscosity of the fluid you're trying to move. And if it gets really high viscosity, it gets really hard to push it through a tube. That's essentially what's happening here, right? So the viscosity of blood is going to be a function of the number of red blood cells in it versus the amount of plasma, right? And if you get higher red blood cell content, it gets much more viscous, or it gets, the viscosity gets higher and it gets harder to push through a tube and creates a resistance to flow. Okay, so viscosity is going to be a function of the percent of the red blood cells present. We call that hematocrit. Okay, so on a normal, here's a scale of hematocrits versus like the viscosity compared to water. Okay, so we live here. And you in particular at sea level live here with a hematocrit of around 40 to 43, 45. You can get, you can provoke humans to get a higher hematocrit, right? If you send them to altitude, the lack of oxygen in the air, over a 2-week period, the body will respond by increasing your oxygen carrying capacity, so increase your red blood cell count, which is a great idea, because you need to carry more oxygen. There is a trade-off with that though. You increase your viscosity, so your resistance to blood flow gets a little bit higher. And humans can live at a certain height based on oxygen and this viscosity problem. We can't live much. There are heights that we can't live at because of this issue. But we're pretty good. There's whole populations that live 14, 18,000 feet high. Okay? So we're pretty good. So they would have normal physiological hematocrits of about 50 or 55, but we don't really physiologically push it up higher than that. Okay, unphysiologically, we can absolutely push it higher than that. So athletes who blood dope, right? So an athlete who wants to increase their oxygen carrying capacity, let's say at sea level, they want to increase their oxygen carrying capacity, so they, prior to a race, months prior to a race, they will take blood off and they'll pack those red blood cells, and just prior to the race, they'll put the red blood cells back, right? Blood doping, don't do that. It's a super bad idea, right? Because if you put in packed red blood cells, suddenly your hematocrit goes way up, and that's what they wanted, because they wanted a higher oxygen carrying capacity. But if they're not careful, the hematocrit can go so high that we start to offer a huge resistance to flow. So that's going to actually drop performance, right? You want to increase performance by increasing oxygen carrying capacity, but you're going to start to drop performance because of a decrease in flow, because of an increase in resistance, because of an increase in viscosity. So you can jack yourself all the way up here unphysiologically. And people have actually killed themselves prior to a race because they put so many red blood cells in there, blood flow stopped. Resistance got too high, flow stopped, super bad day. Okay? So don't try that at home. So we can change it physiologically between 40 to 50, but that's kind of the range. So we're not really going to use then this viscosity term as a way in which the body is going to control resistance. Okay? So what does that leave us with? That leaves us with thinking hard about radius and how powerful radius is in changing resistance. Any small change in radius changes resistance like it's to the 4th power. Okay, so this is a wickedly powerful tool, and it's something that we can change on many time scales. Okay, so the body, this is really the body's go-to tool for messing with resistance to change flow. And of course, flow where? Flow out of this compartment. Okay, so remember, we got to keep our eye on the mean arterial pressure prize. Okay. But we'll circle back to that. Okay, so let's focus in on, we'll abandon viscosity, we'll abandon length and number of vessels, and focus hard on radius, okay? So essentially pulling that equation forward and chopping out all the things that we're not really going to care about, radius or resistance is proportional to radius to the 4th, okay? So how does the body control radius? Now we're talking about controlling vascular smooth muscle contractile state. Okay? That's all we're doing. In Human Phys 1, you talked an awful lot about how you get smooth muscle to contract. Okay, you talked about the actin, the myosin, light chain kinase, and latch states, and all kinds of wonderful stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to assume you know all that, and we are just going to talk about how we upregulate that system or downregulate it. What are the ways to tap into changing the contractile state? Okay. So, first of all, the placement of smooth muscle is really important. Always important to look at where something sits in the body to try to get a feel for what might be communicating with it. Okay, so here's a blood vessel in the it's an arteriole of the ventricle of a cat, and so here we have the lumen. This there's an N there. So this is our blood compartment. Okay, so this is where our blood would be going through. It's clear at the moment because of how they sectioned it. And then remember, if we go back to that standard cross-section of a piece of tissue, the first layer is going to be that endothelial cell layer. So indeed we have these, here he is here, these endothelial cells. Endothelial cell there, looks like there's 3 of them here. Cross-section, all right, so we've got endothelial cells, which come into direct contact with that blood compartment. Okay, so we've got these endothelial cells. Then we have our smooth muscle layer. Okay, so our smooth muscle layer is here. So lots of smooth muscle cells wrapping themselves circumferentially around this lumen, so that contracting the smooth muscle will actually cause the lumen to get smaller. Relaxing the smooth muscle will cause the lumen to get larger, okay? So that's the game afoot here. We talked about that adventitial layer. So that was our medial layer. So our smooth muscles are sitting there. Then we had that adventitial layer where nerves came in to the system, right? So remember we had primarily the sympathetic nervous system. The nerves coming in. Okay, so that's our classic cross-section of that blood vessel, right? We also have the cells of the tissue itself. The ventricular myocytes are sitting here, right? And so here, I've got a ventricular myocyte here. I've got a ventricular myocyte. And you can start to see then how many pieces of tissue are in close proximity to a vascular smooth muscle cell, okay? So we have our ventricular myocytes here. And in any piece of tissue, if this was a piece of pancreas or a piece of skeletal muscle, this would just represent any cells of the tissue. Okay, any cell of a tissue will be that close to a blood vessel, to smooth muscle, right? So that at the end of the day, when you look at where smooth muscle lies in the entire system, you see this incredible convergence of information, this potential convergence to change the contractile state of that piece of tissue. So if we look at where vascular smooth muscle is residing, it's definitely lying right close to endothelial cells. So if an endothelial cell wants to communicate with it, it's paracrine, it's right there. They live together, they hang out together. Okay, so endothelial cells can change the contractile state of the smooth muscle cells in a paracrine fashion. The cells of the tissue can do that too. They're just on the other side. So if the tissue wants to release a product, to change its own blood flow, it can do that as well. Okay, so we have the tissue cells are in close enough proximity to communicate by paracrine means. Okay. And then the adventitial layer is sitting there, and we did talk a little bit about how that adventitial layer did have cells in it that are close enough now to be communicating. So cells of the adventitia could communicate with the smooth muscle through a paracrine mechanism. They hang out together. Okay? So lots of paracrine going on. We talked about nerves coming in, right? So we definitely have nervous control. So now we can change the diameter of this thing by what the brain wants it to do. Okay? So locally we can change its behavior. Centrally now we can change its behavior. Centrally we can change its behavior directly through nerves, or we can have those nerves release hormones. And as soon as we get a hormone circulating in the system, it's in the bloodstream, which is then right besides one cell layer away from smooth muscle. Okay, so our bloodstream, or our hormones, are right close by. Okay, so there is a massive convergence of information coming into a smooth muscle cell. Okay, this muscle cell, smooth muscle cell, has to be an incredible integrator. Can you imagine having this many people telling you what to do? All right, it's unbelievable. The integration a smooth muscle cell has to do, right? But at the end of the day, all that changes is calcium, right? So all of this is vying for changing intracellular calcium, right? So even if you had 6 inputs, at the end of the day, did calcium go up or down? That's what the vascular smooth muscle cell had to integrate and then output, right? Okay, after all of this input, calcium should go down a little bit, which means I'm going to dilate, right? After all this input, okay, calcium is going to go up a little bit, so I'm going to constrict, okay? So at the end of the day, all of this convergence comes down to control of the smooth muscle contractile state, which is calcium, okay? So because of where it lives, it has a lot of advisors. Okay, let's take a quick break before we focus in on these guys. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's get back at it. Let's start to take a little closer look at this convergence of information on a, oh look, it's a smoot muscle. It's not actually a smoot muscle. Smooth muscle, okay? So, let's go to this mayhem. So this is essentially what that vascular smooth muscle cell has to deal with in reality, okay? So for example, this is just kind of again, it's a schematic of that cross-section of the blood vessel with the endothelial cell layer, the smooth muscle cell layer, the adventitial layer. The tissue is outside here somewhere, and blood flow, the lumen is up here. Okay, so this is really just a cross-section of the vessel itself, and we put the vessel in the piece of tissue. Okay, so we do have, for example, if we think about this smooth muscle and convergence of information, we've got, let's just start with the neural input. So we do know that all blood vessels are innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So all blood vessels are innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, except the capillaries. Right, so that makes a lot of sense because there's no smooth muscle at the capillaries, so there's really no need to innervate them. We can't control their diameter, so there's no need to have a wire or a nerve laid in there. All right. They have different impacts on different vessels. Okay, so not all gains are equal. So the amount that you can constrict a vein is going to be less than the amount that you can constrict in an artery or an arteriole. Okay, so in terms of the impact of the nervous system, it's not equal across all vessels. Arteries are definitely impacted greater than veins are. And then even with arterioles, all arterioles are not controlled equally. Okay? There will be more power to constrict or dilate in some vascular beds than there will be in others. So the power or the gain isn't equal either amongst arterioles. So really the neural input is not distributed equally, is really how that's generated. Okay, so the nerves are not distributed equally. So for example, we have vasoconstriction is quite powerful in the skin and in the gut and in the kidney, right? So we have very powerful control over arterioles there. So vasoconstriction is quite powerful when you're talking about the skin, the gut and the kidney. It's less powerful in the brain, skeletal muscle. Okay, so just know that there's a dichotomy, that it's not all equal. Not all tissues are innervated equally. Okay, so not as much power. So really classically, we have our SNS, releases norepinephrine, okay, onto classically a alpha adrenergic membrane receptor population to cause constriction. Okay, so you'll see SNS vasoconstriction very commonly. The heart, not so much. Okay, never a good idea to vasoconstrict or constrict blood flow to the heart. So we have to manage that somehow. We'll get to that in a minute. But that's just to start to introduce that this pathway of vasoconstriction, norepi on an alpha adrenergic membrane receptor population is the common one to cause constriction, but it is not the rule. There are always things that are going to break any physiological rule you try to put in place. Okay? For example, this one. You can get, in some pieces of tissue, what looks like sympathetic nervous system vasodilation using acetylcholine on a muscarinic cholinergic membrane receptor population. That is weird. That looks like the parasympathetic nervous system. All right, but the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't seem to innervate blood vessels. So this seems to be a weird, odd branch of the sympathetic nervous system into a piece of tissue itself. Again, this is just something. This is our rule, SNS vasoconstriction, and this is something breaking the rule. So you just have to be a little bit comfortable with, yep, 90% of the time that rule is going to hold, and 10% of the time something's going to break that rule, okay? And then there are other nervous systems in here. So there's something called a Nance nerve, non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic. So all they're telling you is it doesn't look like the sympathetic nervous system because it's not using norepinephrine and adrenergic system. And it's not using the cholinergic system, so it doesn't look like the parasympathetic system. Non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic. So that just means it's something else. Okay, something than the common. Is it acetylcholine and the parasympathetic nervous system, or is it norepi and the sympathetic nervous system? Those are the rules, and here's one that's going to break it. Okay, we've seen evidence that these non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic nerves use nitric oxide. That's one of their neurotransmitters. Okay, so again, just know the rule and be comfortable with the variability around that rule. Okay. So would acetylcholine be inhibitory because it's PNS? So it's not really the parasympathetic nervous system. It's the sympathetic nervous system, but it will cause vasodilation. So yeah, I know it's weird, but we just got to be comfortable with weird, okay? Because every rule that you want me to make in physiology, there's going to be something that breaks it, okay? I can make a rule for 90% of scenarios. And then there'll be a very creative way the body has used the same tools to get over a problem. And it will use similar tools. It won't invent something completely new. It'll just say, hey, I could use a little bit of acetylcholine, and right? So we're just going to get used to a little bit of variability. But regardless, we've got nerves coming into arterioles that can change its diameter, okay? Let's get rid of this one, autocrine. So these vascular smooth muscle cells talk to themselves. Okay, they release products that will then affect themselves. Okay, really common. Every cell will do it. That's how a cell knows what it's doing, right? Do we understand the role for autocrine? Did you talk about that one in Human Phys 1? The only way a cell knows it's releasing a nitric oxide if that nitric oxide turns around and stimulates itself, right? So cells have to communicate with themselves all the time so they know what they're doing. So we have autocrine control over this thing. Let's go here next with paracrine. Okay, so paracrine in the form coming from the tissue direction. All right, so we've got vasoactive compounds are being released from the surrounding tissue. Right? So for example, working tissue like skeletal muscle or cardiac myocytes, they're always working, right? They're always contracting. Skeletal muscle, you'll control whether skeletal muscle is contracting or not. But working tissue will release products that will influence vessel diameter. So that's why metabolism is written up here, because those vasoactive products are usually a product of metabolism. If you increase metabolism, you'll increase the amount of these vasoactive products and change blood flow, is what the goal is here. So working tissue will release products to influence vessel diameter. Okay, so for instance, if you start running and you contract muscle, you will increase skeletal muscle metabolism. So you'll start cleaving all kinds of ATP, and you'll have byproducts of ATP cleavage like inorganic phosphate, adenosine, and hydrogen ion. Okay. Adenosine is a vasodilator, hydrogen ion is a vasodilator, inorganic phosphate is a vasodilator, right? So you've got these products of metabolism that then get that then diffuse out to affect vascular smooth muscle cells. Okay, so let's say we would then increase adenosine, which would then cause vasodilation, right? Why are we doing that? Because an increase in activity, if a muscle is contracting, it needs more blood flow. So this is skeletal muscle calling for its own blood flow. It's contracting and it's saying, I'm just going to go ahead and increase diameter myself so I can get more blood flow. So these are called metabolic vasodilators. Okay, because they're products of metabolism, they're products of breaking down ATP. So there's lots of them, right? So adenosine is a vasodilator. Your muscle will use more oxygen. So if you actually drop the oxygen in your tissue, you'll get vasodilation occurring. When you increase metabolism, you're going to increase your CO2 production. CO2 is a vasodilator. Because of the action potential coming down, you're going to increase potassium in the extracellular space. It's a vasodilator. Inorganic phosphate from breaking down ATP. Hydrogen ion from breaking down ATP. All kinds of signals coming from an active skeletal muscle, diffusing to the smooth muscle to change radius, to change resistance, to change flow. Okay, so that's the reason for that type of communication. But it's paracrine because they hang out together. It's just diffusion, and then all you may need is to hook up a membrane receptor population. If it's non-lipid soluble, if it's lipid soluble, right? I've got some here that are lipid soluble. Don't require membrane receptor populations, can just diffuse through and change cell function, okay? So we also have paracrine coming from the other side, those endothelial cells, rich source of products, right? So we also have paracrine from on this end, those endothelial cells. Endothelial cells are a really rich source of vasoactive compounds. And they can be stimulated by the hormonal environment. They can be stimulated also by the wall shear stress environment. So they have these interesting receptors on endothelial cells that have part of the carbohydrates that are in the proteins sticking up in the blood flow stream. So when flow goes by, they bend. And when they bend, they then change what the endothelial cell does. So we made up this shear stress now, or this flow sensor that can change what it's releasing. So blood flow or wall shear stress can stimulate endothelial cells to release products. Some of these products I've identified, like nitric oxide, endothelin, so we've met those two before, okay, when we talked about the heart. Prostaglandins, another very common endothelial cell product. But then there are also an entire host of unidentified products. Okay, so that's where you get into something called EDCF, endothelial-derived contracting factor. Endothelin is one of them, but there are more, and they haven't yet been identified. There's an endothelial-derived relaxing factor. Nitric oxide is one of them, but there are more. So because we don't know what they are yet, they just get this name EDRF. And then there's the most elusive one, which has been hunted for now for at least as long as nitric oxide was hunted for, since the mid-90s, and nobody can identify it. An endothelial-derived hyperpolarizing factor. So something is being released from endothelial cells that causes this vascular smooth muscle cell to hyperpolarize. 25 years worth of work, and there are like still 6 candidates as to what this product might be. That being said, it did take about 10 years for nitric oxide. It used to be an EDRF until it was identified as nitric oxide. It did take about a good 15 years to identify nitric oxide, so I think we're probably pretty close to trying to identify what EDHF is, but it's still a mess. Okay, we will leave endocrine until Tuesday.